The most dangerous form of narcissism doesn't shout, it smiles, it weeps, it convinces you that you are the problem. And if you've been feeling confused, emotionally drained, or constantly apologizing in your relationship, there may be a pattern you haven't yet named. If this resonates, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, how often do you quiet your own needs just to keep the peace? That answer matters. The first sign, weaponized victimhood, is one of the most disorienting dynamics you can experience in a relationship. At first, it doesn't seem manipulative. It looks like vulnerability. She appears deeply hurt, misunderstood, mistreated by others, even unlucky in love. You may feel protective. You may feel chosen because she trusts you with her pain. But over time, a pattern begins to reveal itself. Every disagreement becomes a story where she is the injured one. If you express that something she said hurt you, the focus immediately shifts. Now she feels attacked. Now she is crying. Now she is reminding you of everything she has endured. The original issue, your concern, disappears. Instead of resolving conflict, you find yourself apologizing for bringing it up at all. This dynamic conditions you. You begin to anticipate her emotional reactions and soften your words. Then you start filtering your feelings. Eventually, you stop expressing them altogether, not because they don't matter, but because addressing them feels too costly emotionally. The relationship becomes centered on stabilizing her mood rather than meeting mutual needs. What makes this especially powerful is the moral positioning. She presents herself as sensitive, empathetic, or deeply wounded. So when you feel frustrated, guilt begins to creep in. You question whether you're being too harsh, too demanding, too insensitive. Meanwhile, accountability never truly lands. There is always an explanation, a justification, or someone else to blame. Over time, you may notice that the common thread in every dramatic story, every broken friendship, every workplace conflict is her. Yet she remains the constant victim in each narrative. And you slowly become the next character placed into that role without even realizing it. The second sign, image is everything, can be especially confusing because the woman you experience in private may be entirely different from the one the world sees publicly. She is polished, charismatic, socially skilled. People describe her as kind, generous, even inspiring. She knows how to read a room. She understands perception. She carefully shapes how others see her with remarkable precision. But in private, something shifts. The warmth may cool. The empathy feels selective. Your vulnerabilities, which she once seemed to value, may later be dismissed or even used against you. The contrast between her public persona and private behavior leaves you unsettled. When you try to explain your concerns to others, they struggle to reconcile your experience with the person they know. For someone with narcissistic traits, reputation is emotional oxygen. Being admired, envied, or seen as morally superior regulates a fragile sense of self. Criticism, even mild feedback, threatens that carefully crafted image. That's why disagreements often escalate quickly, not because the issue is significant, but because any suggestion of fault feels like exposure. You may also notice how much effort goes into appearances, social media presentation, curated stories about the relationship, performative affection in front of others. The relationship can start to feel like a brand rather than a bond. Your role becomes supporting the narrative rather than living authentically within it. Over time, you may feel invisible in your own relationship. Your private reality doesn't match the public version. And because the outside world validates her image, you may begin to doubt your own perception. That tension between what you experience and what others see slowly erodes your confidence and keeps you silent. The third sign, emotional invalidation disguised as sensitivity, is subtle, which is what makes it so destabilizing. On the surface, she may describe herself as deeply emotional, intuitive, even empathetic. She may say she feels things more intensely than others, and in the beginning, that depth can feel intimate and meaningful. You might even admire how expressive she is, but notice what happens when your emotions enter the space. If you share that you're hurt, disappointed, or overwhelmed, the response often redirects back to her emotional experience. She may say you're overreacting. She may claim your tone was harsh. She may insist that your feelings are based on a misunderstanding. The conversation becomes less about understanding you and more about defending herself. Sometimes the invalidation is subtle, a sigh, an eye roll, a sarcastic response. Other times it is framed as helpful insight. You're just insecure, you're too sensitive, you always take things the wrong way. These statements gradually chip away at your confidence in your own emotional reality. What makes it confusing is that she can be highly expressive about her own feelings. When she is upset, the expectation is immediate understanding and accommodation. When you are upset, the standard shifts. Your emotions are inconvenient, exaggerated, or somehow unfair to her. Over time, this dynamic creates deep self-doubt. You begin second-guessing whether you are justified in feeling hurt. You rehearse conversations in your mind before bringing them up. You minimize your reactions to avoid being labeled dramatic or unstable. The imbalance is quiet but powerful. Her emotional world is treated as complex and valid, while yours is reduced, reframed, or dismissed. And when your feelings are consistently invalidated, you don't just lose arguments, you gradually lose trust in yourself. The fourth sign, subtle competition, doesn't look like open rivalry. It is quieter than that. It appears in tone shifts, backhanded compliments, and moments that should feel celebratory but somehow leave you uneasy. Instead of your success being shared joy, it becomes a point of comparison. When something good happens to you, a promotion, praise, or a personal achievement, watch her reaction closely. Does she seem genuinely happy, or does the energy change? Does she quickly redirect the spotlight back to herself? Maybe she brings up her own accomplishment or reminds you of something she sacrificed or quietly minimizes what you achieved. That's nice, but becomes a familiar phrase. Envy is difficult for anyone to admit, but in someone with narcissistic traits, it can feel threatening. Your growth may unconsciously challenge her need to feel central or superior. If your confidence rises, her sense of control weakens, so the dynamic may shift toward keeping you slightly off balance. Through teasing that feels a bit sharp, comparisons to others, or highlighting your flaws at moments when you feel strong. Over time, you may find yourself shrinking your wins. You stop sharing exciting news right away. You downplay your achievements to avoid tension. You might even hesitate to pursue opportunities because success seems to create distance or conflict. The competition can also extend socially. If others compliment you, she may interrupt, correct, or subtly undermine. Not in an obvious way, just enough to reassert dominance. It is rarely overt hostility. It is strategic diminishment. Healthy relationships amplify each other. But when subtle competition becomes a pattern, the relationship stops feeling like a partnership and starts feeling like a quiet contest where only one person is allowed to shine. The fifth sign, intermittent warmth, is often the most addictive and the hardest to walk away from. She is not distant all the time. In fact, when she is loving, she can be extraordinary, attentive, affectionate, and magnetic. Those moments feel intense and genuine, and they remind you why you stayed in the first place. But the warmth is inconsistent. One week she is deeply connected, future focused, emotionally present. The next, she is distant, irritated, unavailable. There may be no clear reason. You search your mind for what changed. Did you say something wrong? Did you miss something? The unpredictability keeps you hyper-focused on her mood. This pattern creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. When affection is unpredictable, it becomes more powerful. You work harder for it. You become more patient, more accommodating, more self-sacrificing, hoping to return to the good phase. The relationship starts to feel like chasing sunlight between storms. When she withdraws, she may blame stress, your behavior, or vague dissatisfaction. When she returns with warmth, it feels like relief. That relief bonds you more tightly than steady affection ever could. You begin measuring the relationship not by stability, but by intensity. Over time, your nervous system adapts to the chaos. Calm begins to feel unfamiliar. You start associating unpredictability with passion. And because she occasionally shows you the loving version of herself, you hold on to the belief that if you just try harder, communicate better, or prove yourself more fully, that version will remain. But consistent love does not require guessing. When affection is used, consciously or unconsciously, as a reward and withdrawal as a punishment, the relationship stops being secure and becomes a cycle you are constantly trying to win. The sixth sign, gaslighting and narrative rewriting, is where confusion becomes persistent. It doesn't always appear in explosive arguments. Often it unfolds in small, quiet distortions of reality that build over time. You remember a conversation clearly. She said something hurtful. You felt dismissed. When you bring it up later, she insists it never happened that way. She tells you you're misremembering. She says you're twisting her words. She may even seem genuinely offended that you would interpret it that way. The certainty in her tone makes you pause. At first, you assume it's a misunderstanding. Everyone recalls things differently, but the pattern continues. Your version of events is repeatedly challenged. Her version always presents her as reasonable and you as reactive. Over time, you begin second-guessing your own memory. You replay conversations in your mind, trying to verify your accuracy. You might even start apologizing for things you're no longer sure you did wrong. Narrative rewriting goes beyond individual incidents. It reshapes the history of the relationship. She may claim she was always supportive when you remember criticism. She may say you were distant when you recall trying to connect. The story shifts to maintain her innocence and preserve control. What makes this so destabilizing is the erosion of internal trust. When you can't rely on your own perception, you become more dependent on hers. She becomes the authority on what is real, what is valid, what is acceptable. And once that happens, the power imbalance deepens because if she controls the story, she controls the meaning. And if she controls the meaning, she controls how you see yourself within it. The seventh sign, conditional love and approval tied to control, can feel subtle at first because it doesn't arrive as an obvious demand. It appears as preference, as standards, as expectations framed as care. She may say she wants the best for you. She may present her reactions as motivation, but over time, you begin to notice that warmth and approval are directly connected to how well you align with her needs. When you agree with her, support her, and prioritize her, the relationship feels smooth. She is affectionate, affirming, engaged, and you feel valued. But when you assert independence, set a boundary, disagree, or focus on your own priorities, the atmosphere shifts. Distance appears, the tone sharpens, approval disappears. Love begins to feel earned rather than freely given. You may find yourself adjusting your behavior to stay in her good graces. You check your words before speaking. You avoid topics that trigger withdrawal. You prioritize her preferences to avoid conflict. Gradually, your autonomy shrinks, not because she explicitly forbids it, but because the emotional cost of independence feels too high. Control doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it appears as selective affection. When approval becomes a reward and disapproval becomes a form of punishment, the relationship shifts from mutual connection to behavioral conditioning. Over time, this dynamic erodes your authenticity. You may struggle to remember what you actually want versus what keeps the peace. And because the approval feels so good when you receive it, you may overlook how unstable it truly is. Healthy love remains steady even during disagreement, but when affection depends on compliance, the bond becomes less about connection and more about control. The eighth sign, a chronic need for external validation, often sits beneath all the other patterns. It is the driving force behind the image management, the victimhood, the competition, and the gaslighting. At the core, there is an unstable sense of self that constantly seeks reinforcement from the outside. She may crave admiration in obvious ways, seeking compliments, highlighting achievements, shaping how others perceive her, but it can also appear more subtly. She may need to be the most attractive in the room, the most wronged in a conflict, the most insightful in a discussion. Attention, sympathy, and praise become forms of emotional fuel. What makes this difficult in a relationship is that your role gradually shifts into that of a regulator. You become the source of reassurance. If she feels insecure, you must soothe it. If she feels overlooked, you must elevate her. If she feels criticized, you must repair it. And if you fail to provide that validation consistently, tension builds. The relationship can start to revolve around stabilizing her self-esteem. Compliments become expected rather than appreciated. Support becomes required rather than mutual. And if you are going through something yourself, stress, loss, or self-doubt, there may be little room for your needs because her validation demands take priority. Over time, you may feel emotionally exhausted without fully understanding why. It is draining to be someone's primary mirror, especially when no amount of reassurance ever truly satisfies the underlying insecurity. The tragedy is that external validation is never enough to create internal stability. So the cycle continues: more attention, more admiration, more reassurance. And in that cycle, your energy becomes a resource that is constantly used but rarely restored. In conclusion, recognizing these signs is not about labeling or judging. It is about clarity and self-protection. Women with narcissistic traits can be charming, engaging, and even deeply loving at times. But persistent patterns like weaponized victimhood, image obsession, emotional invalidation, subtle competition, intermittent warmth, gaslighting, conditional love, and a constant need for external validation reveal a dynamic that erodes trust, autonomy, and emotional well-being. Awareness is the first step toward breaking free from confusion and self-doubt. When you can identify these behaviors, you reclaim your perspective, your boundaries, and your sense of power. You begin to distinguish genuine connection from manipulation, and you stop questioning your own reality. The truth is, no one should have to adjust, silence, or shrink themselves to maintain another person's approval or emotional balance. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, consistency, and empathy, not cycles of unpredictability, guilt, and constant validation seeking. By understanding these patterns, you equip yourself to make conscious decisions about how much energy, time, and trust you invest. You can protect your emotional health, strengthen your self-worth, and build relationships that uplift rather than destabilize. Recognizing the signs is not just awareness, it is empowerment. The takeaway is simple. Insight is freedom. Once you see these patterns clearly, you no longer fall into confusion or self-blame. You gain the ability to define your boundaries, honor your feelings, and choose connections that are genuinely nourishing. Awareness transforms uncertainty into confidence, chaos into clarity, and manipulation into an opportunity for growth. Your emotional well-being deserves nothing less.